Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
And now, the fabulous Bentley Brothers.
I suppose you know of Moses. I always picture him with a beard.
I picture him with a mustache, though I know that's a little weird.
There was a time when he gathered all the Israelites around. He told them some things and said, I should probably write this down. That's now the book of Deuteronomy. 40 days worth of sermons in 1410 BC. Moses reminded everybody who've been wandering around in the wilderness. God gives you his best, give him your best, and you will be blessed.
Well, good morning, guys, and welcome back. I'm so glad that you joined me again this week so that we can finish up the book of Deuteronomy. It's such exciting stuff to talk about this morning. So last week we had left off with all of the festivals. We talked mostly about Passover, but God had also talked about the harvest party and the festival of tents where the whole community would camp outside. Well, this week he starts off by talking about the kinds of offerings that could be brought, that there were to be no sick animals. He also made up some very specific rules for the day that Israel would eventually want a king. Next, in chapter 18, God calls for his people to be holy because he is holy. In chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, God says this to his people. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, be very careful not to imitate the detestable customs of the nations living there. For example, never sacrifice your son or daughter as a burnt offering. It's pretty harsh. Is that what those people were doing that lived there? And do not let your people practice fortune telling. Reading your horoscope, you mean? Or using sorcery, or interpreting omens, or engage in witchcraft, or cast spells, or function as mediums or psychics, or call forth spirits of the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. It is because these other nations have done these detestable things that the Lord your God will drive them out ahead of you. But you must remain blameless before the Lord your God. The nations you are about to cast out consult sorcerers and fortune tellers, but the Lord your God forbids you to do such things. Now, if you remember, in the story of the Exodus, I told you that the priest of Pharaoh had powers to also turn their staffs into snakes, and they could turn water to blood. Where do you suppose that power came from? You remember that? Next, we turn over to chapter 19. And chapter 19 is really cool because God sets up this thing called a city of refuge. Now, a city of refuge was set up because you remember the commands that God had given was that there would be an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. Now, the people of Israel, they kind of took that to extremes, and Jesus talks about that later. But because God knew the hearts of men, he knew that every once in a while, somebody was going to get killed by accident. Well, would it be fair if it was an accident and the person that accidentally killed another person also got killed? That's not fair. That's not justice. It was an accident. And so God said, in these cases, I want you to set up what's called a city of refuge. And if a person accidentally kills another person, they must quickly run to a city of refuge because the family of the person they killed will surely chase them down and want to kill them unless they make it to the city of refuge. Imagine what that would have looked like. those guys are awesome, right? I can't imagine doing that stuff. But can you imagine running for your life through the wilderness to get to a city so that you would be safe? That story will be really important later when we get to the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Next, in chapter 20, God made up some rules about joining the army. You see, back then, when you became of age, you were automatically in the army. But God made some rules to make exceptions for people who shouldn't be in the army after all. Let me read to you what he said. God says in Deuteronomy chapter 20, and we're going to start in verse 5. He said, "Then the officers of the army must address the troops and say, 'Has anyone here just built a house and hasn't dedicated it yet?'" See, they had this whole dedication thing they did when you had first built a house. "If so, you may go home. You might be killed in battle, and someone else will get to dedicate your house and live in it. Has anyone here just planted a vineyard and not yet eaten of its fruit? If so, you may go home. You might die in battle, and someone else will get to eat your first fruits." First fruits were really special in the Bible. "Has anyone here just become engaged to a girl but not yet married her? Well, you can go home and get married. You might die in battle, and somebody else would marry your true love." Isn't that sweet that God would make a provision for that? Verse 8 says, "Then the officers will also say, 'Is anyone here afraid or worried? If you are, you may go home before you frighten everyone else.'" Isn't that the wisdom of God? To send those who were afraid to fight home so that they didn't scare everybody else in the army. He is so wise. He continues on. He says, "As you approach a town to attack it, you must first offer its people terms for peace. If they accept your terms and open the gates to you, they will become your servants. But if they refuse to make peace and prepare to fight, you must attack the town. When the Lord your God hands the town over to you, use your sword to kill every man in the town, but you may keep for yourselves all the women, children, livestock, and other plunder. You may enjoy the plunder from your enemies that your Lord your God has given you." And so you remember what I told you about how back then that if you left any survivors, it would be like a cancer and it would come back even worse than it was before. And so God had gave specific instructions on who to wipe out and who to let live. But God has mercy, and he said, if they surrender when you get to their gate, then you can let them live, and they will be your servants. And hopefully, they'll become followers of God. Next, we get to chapter 21. Now, chapter 21 deals with things like unsolved murders, or what to do if you wanted to marry one of these girls that had come from one of these other towns where the men had all been defeated. Verses 22 and 23 are really interesting. Check this out. God says, if someone has committed a crime worthy of death and is executed and hung on a tree, the body must not remain hanging from the tree overnight. You must bury the body that same day, for anyone who is hung is cursed in the sight of God. In this way, you will prevent the defilement of the land the Lord your God is giving you as your special possession. Well, what famous person do we know that was hung up on a tree? It was Jesus. And do you remember that Joseph, not his daddy, but another Joseph came and begged for his body so that Jesus wouldn't remain hanging on that cross? Because the Bible said, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. Next, we get to chapter 22. Now, chapter 22 applies to some of you guys, but not quite yet to some of you other guys. Chapter 22 deals with boys and girls and when they start being boyfriends and girlfriends. And God says, you must keep yourself pure until the day you get married. Guys, that means no making out. That's what God commands in Deuteronomy chapter 22, that you should keep yourself pure so that it'll be special on the day that you get married. Now, chapters 23, 24, and 25 all have a bunch of miscellaneous rules, a bunch of commands. You remember I told you there were way more than 10 commandments. There's chapters and chapters of commandments. Isn't that interesting? I'll tell you what's interesting. There are a few in here that I want to point out to you. Here's a really interesting one you can find in Deuteronomy 23, verses 12 and 13. You must have a designated area outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. Each of you must have a shovel as part of your equipment. Whenever you go to poop, you must dig a hole with the spade and cover the poop up. Now, you wouldn't think that you would have to write that down for people, but believe it or not, you do. And it's a good thing you did, right? How about this one? In Deuteronomy 23, verses 21 through 23, it says, "When you make a vow to the Lord your God, be prompt in fulfilling whatever you promised him. For the Lord your God demands that you promptly fulfill all your vows, or you will be guilty of a sin." However, it's not a sin to not make a vow, but once you have voluntarily made a vow, a promise to God, be careful to fulfill your promise to the Lord. He takes them very seriously. Don't break your promises to God. Chapter 24, verse 1 starts out like this. "Suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. Having discovered something wrong with her, he writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house." Now, later on in the Bible, in the story of Jesus, the Pharisees come to him, and they use this same verse to try and trick Jesus by saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason?" And Jesus' answer is, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, God allows divorce. But in the beginning, that's not the way it was. God made one man and one woman, and he brought them together for the rest of their life." And so I told my daughter when she got married that not every day is easy when you're married. But you guys remember this advice from Pastor Bob. Later on, when you get married in life, if you and the person you marry will always talk to each other like two people that really love each other, and you'll keep looking ahead and not looking back, everything will work itself out, and you'll be much happier than you were before. And your lives will just get happier and happier together. But remember, you have to keep talking, and you have to keep talking like you really do love each other and not saying ugly things back and forth. Remember that. In chapter 24, we also have this command: never take advantage of the poor and destitute laborers, whether they are fellow Israelites or foreigners living in your land. You must pay them their wages each day before the sun sets because they are poor and they're counting on it. If you don't, they might cry out to the Lord against you, and it would be counted against you as a sin. God loves poor people. He says we should too. As a matter of fact, he gives another command in verse 19. He says, "When you're harvesting your crops and you forget to bring a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do." Next, we go to chapter 25, and there's a few more of these rules I want to read to you that are really interesting. Chapter 25 starts out like this. It says, "Suppose two people take a dispute to court, and the judge declares that one is right and the other is wrong. If the person in the wrong is sentenced to be beaten, the judge must command him to lie down and be beaten in his presence, with the number of lashes appropriate for the crime." Right there in the courtroom. Can you imagine that? But verse 3 says this, "But never give more than 40 lashes. More than 40 lashes would publicly humiliate your neighbor." And do you know when Jesus was arrested and beaten that night? They gave him 40 lashes because that was the maximum the law would allow. Verse 4 says, "You must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it's treading out the grain." And so back then, if you had an ox, he would be tied up and you would use him to crush the grain so that what they call the husk would separate from the seed. And then the seeds were the good part and the husk was the bad part. Well, they use oxes to walk on top of the grain to make this process happen. So the command was, but you can't put a muzzle, a mouthpiece, over the ox to keep it from stopping and eating some of the grain while it's working. Now, we use this same verse today when we talk about pastors because they are working for the church and they have to eat as well. And so this verse is the one that we use when we say that you should pay a pastor and you should pay him fairly. Next, we get to chapter 27. In chapter 27, God commands they are supposed to set up stones at Mount Ebal. Now, when he commands this, he says, I don't want you to cut the rocks. I don't want you to carve the rocks. I want you to find rocks that perfectly fit together because you are an imperfect people that I have made perfect. Isn't that a cool image? And then he says, and later on, when your children ask you, what do these rocks mean? Then you will tell them to remind us that we are an imperfect people, but through him we are made perfect. Next, God gives a big list of actions that will bring curses on your life. When you have time, you should read Deuteronomy chapter 27. It's really interesting. We won't take time to do it today, but check it out when you have a chance. Next, I want to tell you something God said in Deuteronomy 28, verse 47 and forward. He says this, if you do not serve the Lord your God with joy and enthusiasm for the abundant benefits you have received, you will serve your enemies whom the Lord your God will send against you. You will be left hungry, thirsty, and naked, lacking in everything. The Lord will put an iron yoke on your neck, oppressing you harshly until he has destroyed you. So guys, remember, when you're serving in God's house, it's not a chore, it's a privilege. God has chosen you, not the other way around. So you should serve him with your whole heart and be happy for all the things he's done for you, because if you do, he promises you a life of blessing. Sometimes that's money, sometimes it's friends, sometimes it's fame. It can come in all forms. But you talk to everybody you see that is happily serving the Lord, and I tell you this, they will all tell you the same thing. I am so blessed. Remember that when you get older. In chapter 29, God repeats the covenant that he made. He made it with Abraham way back in Genesis. And he said, you know what, Abraham? The people that come after you, they're going to be hard-headed and stubborn. And even though they're going to break their promises to me, I will always keep my promises to you. Now in chapter 31, Joshua officially becomes the leader of the Israelite people. And the first 4 books of the Bible were read aloud. And Moses predicts that the people are going to get hard-hearted and that they're going to disobey God. In fact, he prophesies a whole bunch of stuff that's going to happen after he's dead and gone. But in this chapter, he lets everyone know that Joshua is to take his place as the ruler, the judge over Israel, the one who will go and speak to God directly. Then finally, we reach chapter 32, where God tells Moses to go and climb a mountain because he's about to die. And he says, Moses, even though I told you you couldn't enter the promised land, I am going to let you see it before you die. I want you to climb that mountain over there and take a good look around. You have served me well for all these years. I'm going to take you on home to live with me forever. You guys, I love the book of Deuteronomy. It's been so great going through it with you. It's going to be really exciting as we continue forward. Hopefully we'll pick up next week in the book of Joshua. See you then. Have a great week. Love you.
It's a letter from God that sets everyone free, a gift for you, for me.